Welcome to the 9th webinar in the Linked Early Modern Drama Online Training Series. This webinar is funded by a connection grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This is our September editorial webinar, which focuses on the why and the what of collation. Brett Greatley-Hirsch has promised to pop in to jump in with elaborations, clarifications, and examples. Our technical webinar later this month will focus on linking and then on the mechanics of encoding collations. I'm Janelle Jenstad. I am a professor in the Department of English at the University of Victoria, where I teach Shakespeare, early modern drama, book history, and digital humanities. I'm the conceptor and director of LEMDO, the editor of The Merchant of Venice for the new Internet Shakespeare editions, and the editor of Thomas Haywood's If You Know Not Me, You Know Nobody, Part 2 for digital Renaissance editions. At UVic and in many institutions in North America and Australia and New Zealand, we like to begin presentations and meetings in a good way by recognizing the land on which we live and work. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasatch peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Our learning outcomes for today are that you will know what a collation looks like. You will know, and you'll be able to define collation. You'll know why we collate. You'll know what to collate and where to draw the line between things that matter and things that don't. You will know how to make a witness list for your modern text. You will have a sense of the workflow possibilities, and you will understand the difference between horizontal and vertical collation. If you have questions, please feel free to ask as we go. Navarra is monitoring the chat for us. Or you can wait for the section header slides, which are marked in this slide deck with a blue question mark inside a square. Okay, so a section header slide looks like this, but I'm actually going to start with what is a collation. If you are working with a print edition, an older print edition in particular, you'll probably find collations between the text of the play and the annotations at the bottom of the page. This is an example from J. Hallio's edition of The Merchant of Venice from Oxford in 1993. And I have put in a blue box the stage direction, flourish of cornets, and the half square brackets in this edition indicate that it's been added by the editor. In the middle of the page, the editor has collated the added stage direction, and you can see that it gives you a way of indicating what line we're on, line 77.1 in this case, flourish of cornets. There's a closing square bracket, and then the words Oxford, and that indicates that this stage direction is unique to the Oxford edition. Followed by a semicolon, and after the semicolon, we have the words not in QF, and that tells us that the stage direction is not present in the quarto text of The Merchant of Venice, nor in the folio text of The Merchant of Venice. So this part to the left of the closing square bracket is known as the lemma. That's the text that we're collating, the text that appears in our modern text about which we want to say something. And then on the right-hand side is the stemma. This part is giving credit to the editor who first introduced that stage direction. And then the part after the semicolon will indicate what's going on with other editions. You will not see collations between the text and the annotations very much anymore. People jokingly called this the band of terror or the barbed wire. You know, before you were able to get down to the annotations that would explain what the text meant, you had to negotiate this very cryptic thing, most students would probably have jumped right over that and gone straight to the annotations. Nowadays, the Ardens will put the collation at the bottom of the page rather than between the text and the annotations. LEMDO, of course, has its own way of doing things because it's a digital project. So this is what a LEMDO edition looks like. This is Edward III, edited by Sonia Masai, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of her co-editor. It'll come back to me. And you can see that there are all these little circles. They have an arrow, a double-headed arrow in it. That's meant to be a fork in the road. So the fork in the road symbol is indicating that there are other possibilities for this particular moment in the text. While our editor has chosen one thing, you might be interested in what other editors have done at this moment, or in how the editor has deviated from the base text that they're following for their edition. And you can see that these fork in the road symbols show up on the scene header, they show up in stage directions, and they show up in the text itself. And Navarra has just reminded me that the second editor is Amy Lidster. Thank you very much, Navarra. As I was saying before 8 o'clock, I am not a morning person. So when a user of the LEMDO site hovers over one of these fork in the road markers, the text that's being collated will be highlighted blue. The user can click on it, and then they will get a collation pop-up. So in this case, I've clicked on the scene 1, and we can see that it's the Oxford edition that first calls this scene 1, right? And that's different from the conventional practice of dividing plays into acts and scenes for Shakespeare. Most non-Shakespearean plays are simply divided into scenes, unless they're Jonson plays. We learned that in the first quarto, that scene header is omitted. Capel divided this play into acts and scenes. Presumably editors after Capel also did likewise, but we don't collate every single editor who did something. We will usually just collate the first editor who did something. So our collations are a little less cryptic than you would get in a print edition. I don't have a slide for this, but if you click on Oxford or First Quarto or Capel, you can see they're underlined, which indicates a hyperlink. You'll get full bibliographic information for those sources. Okay, so there's a little less parsing required of the user of the LEMDO edition. And that's because, you know, our editions are pitched at the third-year classroom student and the theater practitioner. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to collate. There are various definitions of collating. So if you're coming at this for the first time, you might think, oh, I thought I knew what that word meant. You know, photocopiers have an option to collate. If you're in an Anglican or Catholic church, bishops get collated. But we're talking about this very specific kind of collation, which is the third definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. To collate, to compare critically a copy of a text with other copies or with the original in order to correct and amend it. That is a textbook definition from my perspective. In this article by Barbara Bordaleo, you're collating just fine and other lies you've been telling yourself. She defines collation as the systematic comparison of two or more texts with the aid of a base text, a text specifically used as a referencing system, or without one. So in some cases, you will collate without a base text, but we haven't had any instances of that yet in LEMDO. I'll come back to this article. You're collating just fine, and other lies you'll be telling yourself. It's worth a read. Okay, so any questions so far? So there are a number of reasons why we collate, and I'm going to go through, I think I've got 6 in the slide deck. I'll go through them one by one. The first reason is to grapple with the early texts that bear witness to the work we are editing. Nothing teaches you what's going on in the early quartos, early folios, if there are any for your play, than the process of collation. You become intimately aware of what early readers would have seen. You become intimately aware of what the printer was doing in the print shop. So, good morning, Brett. Critical judgment must expand from a logical basis in bibliographical and linguistic fact. That's Fretzenbauer's in On Editing Shakespeare. And so, we can't exercise critical judgment until we know what the facts of the text are. Collation will help us do that. Barbara Bordaleo again. The methods used for identification and selection of variants through collation affects the researcher's understanding of textual relationships and her perception of the text. It's actually one of my favorite things to do. People grumble about how long it takes, but it's such a delight to have these early texts in front of us and to be looking at them really closely in a way we rarely have the luxury and time to do. The second reason why we would collate early publications is to record the evolution or the lines of transmission of a text. If you've ever worked with manuscript poetry or medieval manuscripts of John Donne, for example, you'll be very used to looking at stemma, where people are trying to establish which manuscript came first, which one was copied from which one. We can do the same thing with printed texts. This is a speculative transmission of Musidorus, all 17 plus quartos of it, which a student and I did last summer, Sophia Spiteri. And we determined that there were some oddities in here, that the transmission wasn't simply a case of the printer going to the most recent copy of the text and setting the new text from that. There were some kind of recursive moments in it. And of course, there was the introduction of new manuscript material for the third quarto in 1610, performed by the King's Men. That's the text that everybody gets excited about because some people think Shakespeare might have had a hand in it. Personally, I don't think he did, but that association with the King's Men is pretty powerful. A third reason why we collate is to record other textual possibilities for our readers, especially if we plan to talk about them in our textual introduction. So I'm actually including the second quarto of The Merchant of Venice in my collation. It's the famous 1619 Pavier quarto, which is falsely dated. It often gets ignored in work on The Merchant of Venice because it was framed as a bad or stolen or pirated quarto. Opinion has changed on that matter quite considerably. I got interested in what's going on in Q2, first of all, because of Sonia Masai's book, Shakespeare and the Rise of the Editor, in which she argues that Pavier was functioning like an editor and making editorial interventions that we wouldn't see again until 1709. And then also Zach Lesser's Ghosts, Holes, Rips, and Scrapes, Shakespeare in 1619, Bibliography in the Longue Durée, which talks about what might have actually been happening when Pavier was printing those quartos. So I actually like some of the readings in Q2. I think they work better. And I discussed Q2 extensively in my textual introduction and refers to my collation. So all of that is just to say that our collations are of critical moment, and they should be responsive to what's happening in textual criticism and bibliographical studies generally. So it's now expected that you'll look at Q1 of Hamlet, you'll look at those quartos that used to be called bad quartos and are now more commonly called short quartos. They've been brought back into the canon of texts that we want to look at, and we're interested in them because they might record something about performance or something about a particular textual moment. Fourth reason we collate is to record departures from our copy text. So for my edition of Merchant of Venice, I've taken Q1 as my copy text. I say in my textual essay that I'm taking Q1 as my copy text. But if I adopt a reading from F, I am departing from my Q1 copy text. I don't have to record where I'm following Q1, but I do have to record when I depart from Q1. So in this case, in the third speech of the play, Solanio talks about piring in maps in Q1, which doesn't quite make sense from a modern perspective. Q2 has PIERING, which is kind of interesting given the nautical context here. It suggests to me maybe the compositor didn't quite understand what was going on, because ports and piers comes later in the line, and he might be picking up on that. Q3 has prying, which is a plausible word. F1 has peering, and that's what most past editions have done. So I, like other editors who have taken Q1 as their copy text, have chosen to follow F at this moment, on the grounds that it is likely a more plausible reading, perhaps even a correction of what shows up in Q1. A fifth reason we collate is to give credit where credit is due to early editors. We have been marinated in our careers in the idea that we must cite our sources. Collation is no different. We always want to give credit to editors who came before us, who made interesting interventions in the text that we want to adopt for our edition. So here's an example from the beginning of James Murdoch's edition of Henry V. The opening stage direction in this edition reads, enter chorus as prologue. We have our fork in the road marker to indicate that something interesting is going on here. So James is giving credit to Craig. It was Craig who first used the stage direction, enter chorus as prologue. F1 has enter prologue, and Capel in 1779 changed that to enter chorus. So Craig wanted to have his cake and eat it too, presumably, and indicate that the chorus was delivering the prologue of the play. And James has elected to follow that reading, but he can't just put it in there suggesting that it's his. He has to give credit to Craig for doing that first. And the sixth reason is to acknowledge our own interventions in the text. Many of us working on the LEMDO project are editing texts that have never been edited before or have had very few additions. In these cases, it is entirely plausible that you will be introducing new readings of the text. And in this case, you need to give credit to yourself. You could flip that around and say you need to accept blame if it's wrong, but let's frame it positively. You need to give credit to yourself as the person who made this original new intervention in the text. So this is from one of the mayoral shows. I can't remember which one at this juncture. This edition elects to give us this lactea via as a path is given, but to give us that reading, the editor has had to remove parentheses that are present in the quarto. So the editor wants to indicate that the quarto did in fact read as a path with parentheses. Okay, pause for questions. All right, so let's move on to what to collate. What variations to collate? So we're interested in collating variants or differences between witnesses when they are substantive. So differences between Q and F, or between Q1 and Q2, or between the quarto and the duodecimo text of Galatea, for example. So let's pause for a definition of substantives and accidentals. These terms were offered by W. Gregg in the Rationale of Copy Text, and he defines them as follows. Substantive variants affect the author's meaning. Accidental variants, on the other hand, are matters in which scribes and typesetters follow their own habits or inclination, and presumably they don't affect the author's meaning. Gregg was writing before the death of the author, so we could reimagine that. After the death of the author, substantive variants affect the text's meaning. We don't really want to go down the road of trying to guess what the author intended. What has survived from the early period is text, and we're working with text. Okay, so here's a really famous example. This is from Hamlet's first soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet, when the stage is cleared and Hamlet's left alone after the big court scene. And we have 3 texts that we need to take into account with Hamlet, early texts. Q1, which is quite different from Q2, much shorter. Oh, that this too much grieved and sallied flesh would melt to nothing. Q2 says, oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. That sounds more familiar. And the folio says, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Sallied, solid is a famous textual crux that every editor has to resolve. Sometimes in my graduate class, I will bring in my 32 editions of Hamlet and hand them out and have students look at that particular crux, and we'll see what the editor happened to do at that moment. And it's quite interesting. It's not always the case that an editor taking F1 as the copy text will choose solid. They might actually choose the Q1, Q2 reading, usually modernizing the spelling to sullied, meaning dirty. I've also highlighted the word dew here. So Q2 has dew, lowercase d, E-W-E, and the folio has dew, capital D, E-W. So I'm going to make the claim that sallied and solid is a substantive difference between early texts. Whereas dew and dew is an accidental difference. You can simply modernize the spelling in your modern edition and don't have to acknowledge that it's spelled differently or that the capitalization is different in another text. In between this rather obvious substantive difference, one of the more famous textual cruxes, and this rather obviously accidental difference, there's a huge gray area, and it will take you some time to calibrate how you want to handle your collation. You will need advice from your anthology lead, and you'll want to make a record of what you're doing. So, where you draw the line between accidental and substantive really depends on the type of edition that you're doing and the type of text that you're editing. So in this graphic here, everything to the left of the triangle is accidental and wouldn't therefore be collated. And I'm suggesting, for the sake of argument, that for a project like the Moemel mayoral shows, you would set the point for separating accidentals from substantives quite far to the left. And that means that you would take fewer things as accidental and more things as substantive. That means you would collate more things when you're editing a mayoral show than you would if you were collating a Shakespeare play. Okay. I'm suggesting that Shakespeare editors probably want to put the line closer to this end. So more things are accidental and fewer things are substantive. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. The most obvious one being that there are many editions of Shakespeare that have done this ad nauseum. So you really just need to touch very lightly on differences between the text. You also have a lot more material to draw on as an editor of Shakespeare, and there is the weight of consensus and tradition making decisions about the text for you. With the mayoral show, you might be making this decision for the first time. You probably want to give the other options to the reader just in case you got it wrong. You don't have the weight of tradition. You don't have lots of sources to draw on to confirm that you've made the right decision. Okay, so if you're editing Shakespeare, you might not collate the fact that you chose to put a semicolon in this reading here. But you would for a mayoral show because you might be the first editor who's sorting this out into modern grammatical units, taking the early modern rhetorical punctuation and turning it into modern grammatical punctuation. What's really important in editing, and that applies to all dimensions of editing, not just collation, is consistency. So once you've made a decision for yourself about how you're going to collate the text in your edition, you need to be consistent in that practice. So establish principles of what's substantive in your edition and what is accidental. Those principles may already be set by your anthology, but if you find that a particular use case isn't covered by your anthology, then you need to make a decision for yourself and execute it consistently. Because we tend to pick away at collation over a long period of time, you'll want to record those principles for yourself so that when you come back and pick up Act 2 after 8 months of teaching, you can follow the principles that you set for yourself the previous summer. When in doubt, always go back to your own principles and make sure you discuss them in your textual essay. Okay, what variants to collate? You can collate press variants, and I'm going to say a few more words about this at the end. If you're collating press variants, you're collating differences between copies of a single publication. Let's pause for a definition here. LEMDO can support two types of collation. One type of collation is sometimes known as horizontal collation, sometimes also called synchronic collation. So you're collating variants that occur at the same time in the same print run. You're collating multiple copies in a single publication, and you're looking for press variants. Sometimes it's obvious that one is a corrected version. It's not always obvious which is the corrected page. Generally, LEMDO doesn't encourage editors to do horizontal collations. It's expensive to go and look at lots of books in libraries. It's expensive in terms of time. And in the case of well-known playwrights like Shakespeare, it's been done. The kind of collation I've been talking about mostly is the vertical collation. It's a diachronic collation that collates variants across time. So instead of looking at multiple copies of a single publication, we're looking at multiple publications from different years. And when we're collating multiple publications, we're usually collating an imagined ideal copy. Okay, an imagined ideal copy doesn't exist, except in the case of Hinman's folio of Shakespeare, which takes only corrected pages and brings them together in something that never existed in the early modern period. And the vertical collation would also include scribal changes if there are multiple manuscripts of a text, or editorial changes once the editorial tradition kicks in and we work these texts over and over and over again. If you were going to do a horizontal collation of press variants, you would do something like all extant copies of the 1613 Triumphs of Truth, which our editor of Triumphs of Truth is in fact doing because it's the most canonical Lord Mayor's show, and yet no one has done a collation of press variants of this text. Big stop sign. This is not required. Rarely is it necessary, and it's usually been done for canonical plays. If you're interested, there's a really wonderful recent article by Sarah Neville called The Accidentals Tourist, in which she talks about how the rise of air travel made it possible for people to do horizontal collations. And she talks about how it's an exclusionary editorial practice, which makes it difficult for early career scholars that don't have very light teaching loads and lots of research funding to do editions, and it excludes people with caregiving responsibilities. So LEMDO is designed to be accessible to our editors, so we absolutely do not want to put those kinds of barriers in the way of our editors. So even if it hasn't been done before, you don't have to do it. All right, so back to vertical collations. We have to make decisions about what to include in our collations. There's over 800 editions of Shakespeare in the 19th century. We're not going to collate them all. We don't need to collate them all. Many of them are derivative of each other anyway. So we have to make decisions about what really matters in the textual history and what is going to be helpful to our end user, the scholar who is coming to our site for an introduction to a new play, the student who's reading it in class, maybe the theater practitioner, although in my experience, theater practitioners aren't always super interested in textual variants. So for Shakespeare, you would definitely want to collate all of the early publications. So for my imagined play here, Q1, Q2, F1, F2, maybe you would go to F3 and F4 if you had time. Okay. You would definitely collate Rowe from 1709, the first editor of Shakespeare, Pope, Tybalt, Johnson. So those are the 4 editors that were commissioned by Jacob Tonson to edit the plays. They're really laying down the editorial tradition that we've been grappling with ever since. Malone, who made the first major changes to that tradition. Dice. You might collate the Ardens. We're on to Arden 4 now. Oxford, Cambridge, maybe Norton, although it's based on the Oxford. So you're kind of figuring out for yourself what the important editions are. You can do that work in conjunction with your coordinating editor. If you're doing one of the canonical non-Shakespearean plays, the sorts of texts that appear in Dodsley's Old English plays and have become canonical classroom texts because of Dodsley, you would want to collate Q1, whatever Dodsley does with it. You might want to collate the Rutledge revivals, Taylor and Lavanino's complete works of Thomas Middleton, maybe Elizabeth Shaper's edition of The Witch. So I would say the answer here is most of the editions. If you're doing something like Middleton's Civitatis Amor, which Mihaela Galliford did, the answer is all the editions, even if they're not very good editions. Something that a lot of people have ended up collating for these lesser known texts are the pieces of text that show up in Geoffrey Bulla's narrative and dramatic sources of Shakespeare. Some people have been working with texts that have such a slim editorial history that the piece of the text that's included in Bulla as an example of a source for Shakespeare effectively is the only modern-ish edition that we have. You would never collate that for a canonical play, but for a very non-canonical play, you might need to. Okay, Brett weighs in saying you should also collate the Rebel's Companions library edition of The Witch. Thank you, Brett. This is why I consult Brett about such matters. So, when you're thinking about what text to collate for the vertical collation. Here are some questions that you can ask as you're trying to make these decisions. Which publications matter for your anthology? Which publications matter for your play? And which publications matter for your approach? So if you're taking a performance-informed approach, you'd probably want to privilege any editions that take a similar approach. You know, that's the literary critical work that you have to do for, it's kind of like a literature review. So should you publish all early publications? Collate all early publications, I mean. Should you collate all editions ever? Should you collate important editions? Should you collate editions that have influenced you? Should you collate editions that are working towards the same text as you? So if you can answer those questions, you will be a lot closer to your witness list. Important note, we're not producing variorum editions. Other people are doing that work, at least for Shakespeare. We're not interested in providing a complete history of what's happened to the text over time. And you'll want to talk to your anthology lead. You'll also want to talk to Brett Greatley-Hirsch, who is on this webinar. He has a resource called the Bibliography of Editions of Early English Drama. If I want to know what the editions of a text are, I will write to Brett and he will send me back a list of all the editions that have ever been produced of this play. So eventually we're going to roll Bede out as a LEMDO branded resource, but for now it lives on Brett's computer and in Brett's head. I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything about it, Brett.
Sure. Well, it's a long-term work in progress, but you've really hit the nail on the head, Janelle, and that's even for pretty obscure titles, there are often multiple editions, and the sets of questions that you put through there, I think, are really important. I mean, the question of importance is also quite tricky. What constitutes importance? And I'm reminded here of Molly Yarn's book about Shakespeare's lady editors and how the editorial tradition can be skewed if we don't take a more holistic view. So going back to your question about which editions you should be collating, there are plenty of editions that have never been collated by scholars working on critical editions of Shakespeare. So, for example, there are a whole bunch of teaching editions which may have come up with really novel and interesting solutions to textual and performance cruxes, which the wider scholarly community is just simply unaware of. But taking a broader view of collation and what constitutes your list of editions to collate, I think also feeds into larger questions about representation, thinking about the kinds of editors and the kinds of editions that you want to consult and you want to promote. But that's all from me. Keep watching this space. We are hoping to launch Bede in 2026.
Thanks, Brett. I appreciate your point about representation. All right, so how to make a witness list. Once you've figured out what you want to collate, you'll need to make what's known as a witness list. We'll cover how you do that in TEI in a later webinar. DEEP, the Database of Early English Playbooks, is an essential source for early witnesses. When you are working with DEEP, make a note of the STC number or wing number if it's published after 1640, and the DEEP number. Those are numbers that we actually capture in our bibliography, and we make a direct link from our bibliography back to the DEEP entry via a partnership with DEEP. DEEP corrects a lot of things from Greg. So yes, absolutely use Greg. It's full of juicy information that's not in DEEP, but use it in conjunction with DEEP, which corrects some key information. You'll also want to check LEMDO's bibliographical database. And once you're working on the LEMDO dev site, our development server, where we do all of our work that we're not ready to show the world, you can go directly to that. We have a lot of things already in our bibliography. Many of these things are going to move over to Deep or Bead, I'm sorry, once we get Bead up and running, but for now they're sitting in Bibble, and they all have their own XML IDs. So F1, the XML ID of that is MRWI, short for Mr. William Shakespeare. F2 is MRWI2, MRWI3, and so on. We tried to make that one easy to remember. We've also listed all of the editions that are in the new Oxford Shakespeare. And we tend to quote from the new Oxford Shakespeare in our critical paratext, unless we have a reason to quote from a different edition. So you can see this edition by Rory Luffnan has the XML ID LOUG5. So a lot of things are already there, and you can see that we've got, oops, I've got a very sensitive mouse today. You can see that we've included the World Shakespeare Bibliography number there, and it's actually hyperlinked to the WSB. So you should also be checking the World Shakespeare Bibliography, which is either it has just released an update or it's about to release an update. The WSB record number is something that you should capture while you're putting together your bibliography for your witness list. The record number is used to construct the direct URL to this entry. And if we go back a slide, you can see that that record number is actually hyperlinked. And if we clicked on that, if we were in the live LEMDO dev environment and we were logged into the World Shakespeare Bibliography, we would go directly to this entry. Okay, so there is this planned integration of our bibliography, the database of early English playbooks, bibliography of editions of early English drama, and the World Shakespeare Bibliography. At the end of the day, your witness list is unique to your edition. It will overlap with other editions, and it will be linked to other projects. For now, all of your witnesses have to be in Bibble 1, our shared LEMDO-wide database, but we do have this long-term integration plan. I'm going to just show you this slide with a bunch of TEI on it. I know we have people on this call who are not comfortable with TEI yet, or who are just learning it, and some who are experts. So today's webinar is not about teaching you how to encode things in TEI. I just want to show you what it would look like in Bibble 1. We can do this encoding for you if you send us all of the information, preferably formatted properly, then we can encode it for you, right? So we need the author, we need the title, we need the place, the printer. If it's an early text, we actually include, so-and-so, printed by so-and-so for so-and-so, and then the year, because for us, who printed something, who published something actually matter. STC and deep numbers, ESTC number. Actually, we can't ask for that right now because the ESTC is down, as you know, with the cyber attack on the British Library, and or the World Shakespeare Bibliography number. If you send that information to lemdotech@uvic.ca, we will encode it, add it to Bibble 1, and send you back the XML IDs. Okay, just a comment or two on workflow. You can collate before or after you modernize the text, and there's no one way to do this. Looking at the chat here, Brett reminds me that there is a temporary interface for ESTC put together by the good folks at the Print and Probability Project. So the link is in the chat there, https://estc.printprobability.org. Right. So, there are 4 co-coordinating editors on Digital Renaissance editions and the new Internet Shakespeare editions, and 2 of us like to collate first and 2 of us like to collate after. So that should tell you that, there really is no one right way to do this. If you collate before you modernize the text, the advantages are these. You can take stock of the variants before you modernize. So basically, you're doing your microscopic literature review before you do your own work. You can modernize according to the tradition. It's very good for eclectic editions where the editor is taking the best reading that they think is the best for whatever reasons, from a variety of potential copy texts. And it allows you to take stock of the editorial tradition first. So really, you're doing your literature review first. If you collate after you modernize, it means you're working solely with your base text. You modernize according to a set of principles without being influenced by tradition. It's very good for copy text editions where you sit down and say, I'm going to do a Q1 Merchant of Venice. And I'm going to follow Q1 unless there are really, really compelling reasons to follow another copy text or introduce an emendation. And you avoid being influenced by previous editors. In practice, I find that I'm doing a little bit of collation and a little bit of modernization at the same time. Okay, any quick questions before we move on to the last bit of this slide deck? Okay, so let's, Molly, yes.
Hey, sorry, is my volume on? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question. So this is interesting, the before versus after to me. And I am wondering, like, thinking about the doing it after modernizing, if there is a kind of potential risk of realizing that you would then want to change something you had modernized once you get into that collation. Does that happen? Does that create problems on the back end?
No, not at all. No,
Okay.
you're in complete control of your collation and your modernization.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's just quickly revisit horizontal collation. Reminder, that's the collation of press variants. So differences between copies of a single publication. If you have a reason to do a horizontal collation, we're actually going to handle it a little bit differently from the vertical collation in terms of the technology. While the collation entries themselves will function exactly the same way, if you're doing horizontal or press variants, you'll be collating against one of your early texts. So your well, actually, let's look at the vertical reading first, because this is kind of the norm, and then we'll talk about the departure from the norm. So for the vertical collation, where you're collating differences between publications and differences between subsequent editions, you're going to be collating against your modern text. All right, so the file name for the collation will actually include the name of the modern text. So for Merchant of Venice, the collation file is emd_mv_m_collation, because I'm collating against the modern text of the Merchant of Venice. Okay. And we'll skip over the first row. Collation files will point to the anchors in the modern text. Right. And I'm placing those anchors in the modern text. All of that apparatus that I showed you screenshots of will show up in the HTML file of the modern text. If you're doing a horizontal collation of press variants, you will be collating against one of your semi-diplomatic transcriptions. So let's say Q in this case. The collation file name would include the name of the file that you're collating against. So if I were to look at all the surviving copies of Q1 Merchant of Venice, which I have no intention of doing, I would have a file called EMD_MV_Q1_collation. And in that file, I would capture all of the differences between the copies of the text. And I've picked the Boston Public Library copy for my semi-diplomatic transcription of Q1 Merchant of Venice, partly because it's on the Internet Archive, but also because it's a nice, clean copy with relatively generous margin, so it's easy for people to read. But I would then go and look at other copies to see if they had any press variants. My collation file would point to anchors that I would put in that semi-diplomatic text. I'd put the anchors in my Q1 text, and the clickable apparatus would show up in the HTML file of the semi-diplomatic text. Okay, there are very few cases where you want to do that. But one case where an editor did want to do it, Mark Caitler edited London's Tempe from 1629, I think. No, date's wrong, but I don't remember what is the right date. He was looking at the copy in the National Library of Scotland, and he actually discovered an emendation, a press variant that hadn't been looked at by any previous editors, and it actually did change the meaning of the text. And so he has collated that in his edition. So that's a case where you might want to do it. The collation, the horizontal collation file will be relatively small compared to the vertical file. For a full-length play, sometimes people have 4,000 apparatus entries. That's normal. All right, resources and further reading. We have a whole chapter on collation in the LEMDO guidelines. There's also a section on collation in the Digital Renaissance editions editorial guidelines, which also apply to the new Internet Shakespeare editions. I encourage all anthology leads to follow the DRE editorial guidelines. Navarro's put the link to the collation chapter into the chat, and when we distribute these slides, they have the link embedded. Here are the references to the two articles I mentioned. Barbara Bordalejo and Adam Vasquez, you're collating just fine, and other lies you've been telling yourself. it's quite a funny article, but also a bit of a wake-up call. And Sarah Neville's The Accidentals Tourist, Greg's Rationale of Copy Text and the Dawn of Transatlantic Air Travel, also worth the read. So we've got 5 minutes for questions, so I will open the floor.
Janelle, my question's kind of obvious, but just to go back to something you said a little while ago about like mom's editions versus, say, things like Shakespeare, you were just mentioning about sort of horizontals versus verticals. Almost probably likely very few at all horizontal collations versus a much larger verticals collations file for a mom show, for example. That'd be just the last things you were talking about in terms of horizontal versus vertical. And you were saying that your horizontal collation file will be much smaller.
Yeah.
Verticals, which completely rings true. But I mean, again, you were talking about the fact that likely with the Lord Mayor show work, which certainly I've found, you're leaning very much towards most things being substantive because you're mostly working vertically.
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah. One thing about the mayoral shows is that a lot of them survive in a single copy.
Yeah.
A single copy in the collection of Humphrey Dyson's antiquarian pamphlets at the British Library, which even Mark Caitler wasn't allowed to look at. So.
Okay, cool, thank you.
So if only one copy survives, there are no press variants to collate. Your semi-diplomatic transcription is a transcription of that single copy. You might have some things to say about things you think are probably wrong.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming out today. The next webinar is going to be 2 weeks from today, and Navarro will be talking about linking. And then we'll loop back to, once you understand how linking works, we'll loop back to collations and we'll talk about the actual mechanics of encoding collations.